Okay, we have recording in progress. And so we are going to be discussing at length internal controls, internal control system. You got me tongue tied, The objectives of this chapter, which will be our last chapter. And I'm going to miss you guys. That's all I can say. We are going to be trying to define why internal controls are important. What's their purpose? And the framework in which they should be in place, which should be all the caveats that are put in place in order to do this. And then the how it ties in with risk management and corporate governance. Because once you set down the rules as to how we would govern ourselves, there should be some controls in place to check to make sure what it was we intended to happen is now actually happening. And then we'll have to identify and assess the importance of elements of internal control systems. Are they good? Are they bad? Is there still loopholes? The fact that from time immemorial, we've seen financial scandals after financial scandals. We've seen it go from the thousands to the millions, now to the billions. Despite the fact that we have all this legislation on our books and the fact that persons are saying we have these auditors and internal audit and checks and balances and all those things that have been put in place, how does these play a role in and connected to corporate governance? So that's what we really want to be talking about. And what we want to talk about is, I think I lost Tamiko, what is meant by internal controls and why internal controls are important to financial service providers. And in any business, you would want to have internal controls. And all institutions, and particularly financial institutions, are expected to have some sort of system of internal controls and must be prepared to demonstrate to the financial secretariat, as well as the financial intelligence unit, as well as the central bank, and those kinds of people, that they are effective, they are in place, and they are effective. What I hear when I move around is that companies, a lot of people say they have the rules in place and they are effective as gatekeepers onboarding clients and customers. But from there, all kinds of things happen. So the controls should be in place not only in an environment where you're talking about onboarding, but you're actually looking at continual inspection of the controls. And these controls are independent of any AML, CFT requirements. And so on page 146, for example, it has a definition in terms of what we mean by when we talk about control. And I will read it directly from what it says here. Planning sets the road that an organization will travel. Internal control systems are the means of keeping the organization on that road and ensuring that if it strays from the road, appropriate action may be taken. The challenge we found is that sometimes people stray from the road and appropriate actions are not taken. An internal control may be defined, and this is critical, as an action taken by management to enhance the likelihood that established objectives and goals will be achieved. Management must plan, organize, and direct the performance of sufficient actions to provide reasonable assurance that these goals and objectives will be achieved. So as a result of it, control is the result of proper planning, organizing, and directing by management. So the controls that we're talking about is not necessarily financial only. we are looking at the whole planning and organizing of the organization. And so on page 80, on 147, it talks about elements of control systems. And the control systems incorporate the following components: targets and standards and objectives. They have some sensors, and the sensors detects the control system behavior and gathers information from it. Any inputs and processes and outputs, the main operational stages of the control system. It compares plans, what was planned, to what the actual outcome was. They call them comparators. Effectors controls action taken to change the system behavior. And so if you are getting the desired result, then we say, okay, fine. If you're not getting the desired result, then there should be some corrective measures that should be taken in order for the control system to be maintained and sustained. So the cybernetic model, which describes the process of control within a system that is usually represented by a closed control system or a cycle. So everything is within and maintained in the system itself in order to control the system itself. So all the plans and standards of the performance, all the actions, the measurements of the result is within the organization itself. Any forecasts for the next period, okay, they are there. Now, what they also mentioned was an alternative approach, which sets out that there's this period of identification of objectives, setting targets for the objectives, measuring achievement and output. There is usually a disconnect or misalignment between the objectives and the goals and the strategic plans and the vision from what the systems and the procedures are in place. That's where and that gap is where issues fall through the cracks. But you should be able to, and of course, all of this should be aligned with the organization's corporate culture. And culture is very important. You cannot reduce the impact of a corporate culture. You have some organizations that have a culture of dishonesty. No matter what corporate governance you put in place, if the culture is to be lackadaisical or a culture of dishonesty, they're going to find some dishonest ways to bypass X, Y, and Z. Or if you have somebody who has the opportunity to sign off on certain things, and you see that that becomes the norm as opposed to exception, then you have a problem. Because that person with that pen is too authoritative in order to have the systems and the controls work independent of their pen, which means that depending on how they're feeling on any given day, is how that pen will be affected and vice versa. And so you want to be careful if there are any intervening entity or person every time the situation come up. The whole idea of putting controls in place and system controls in place is that it should work automatically, independently, and objectively, as opposed to subjectively. And so you have to be measuring the achievements and outputs. You have to be comparing achievement with targets. You have to be identifying what corrective action may be necessary if identify what corrective action may be necessary, and then turn around and implement corrective action. There are some organizations that are heavy on documentation and low on execution. Or they write a lot of stuff, but they never assign tasks, specific tasks for specific individuals to carry out. And so control systems must be dynamic and has to be changing from time to time. And as issues come up, that might affect the system that exists, new things should be implemented and put in place. And so this implies that there must be a flow of information information between the managers and those who make decisions and the person who carry out the task in order to preempt any future issues and any problems. And so for managers, I mean, as simple as walking about, you could see that the system that you put in place and controls that you put in place is supposed to be happening. You also have the situation where some companies, to make sure that the systems work, they rotate staff periodically. And usually when they rotate staff, if there's no issues or any problems that come up, then that signals to them that the systems are working the way it should be working. Because if John is suddenly out of the mix and nothing happens, and Paul is now there or Mary is now there, and everything goes as clockwork, then it's bound to suggest that the systems and the controls are in place. If John don't want to go on vacation, or John can't take vacation, or whenever he's on vacation, he comes running back into the office and whatever have you, that signals that there is some issue. That signals to anyone overseeing that we got a potential problem. Because John is now behaving as if, in order for the system to work, he has to be in place and he has to touch it. The flows of information can take several forms. You have the feedback control, feed forward control. What do I anticipate? What do I expect? Any comparison of the actual results that you would want, and trying to forecast what could be the result. And also to, I remember when they first started to introduce all the KYC documentation and whatever have you, the private sector in particular, because I could speak to the private sector, had no idea the cost of compliance, what they would need to change in terms of actual paper documentation. The majority of these legislation was coming so fast and furious that they had to end up hiring lawyers and actually having a legal department, for example, or hiring accountants and rather than just a bookkeeper to keep up with the legislation and all the international reporting that needs to go on. There's lots and lots more of that actually happening. And so to have people at a certain expertise level and experience, it took some while getting companies up to speed. And in the short term, they were actually paying a lot more in legal fees than they would have anticipated prior to all these changes being made. Okay, so the feedback that comes from the different departments to compliance or to audit, for example, and now a lot of companies have accountants in their offices as internal auditors, even before it goes to the external auditors. And you're having them to sign off and double check and whatever else. For example, in the insurance industry, not only do we have internal auditors and external auditors, we have to have a AML audit in addition to all of that. And some is going to government regulation, some is going to the Insurance Commission of the Bahamas. And somehow they're hoping that it all ties back to what the central bank and everybody else is looking for in terms of the Ministry of Financial Services or Department of Financial Services. I can't remember how all is all cut up now in that particular environment. But every time you put a different tier of controls, you're actually adding to the cost. In terms of all of the ideas behind control, you have to be in a position where the systems must be objective. Because if it's not a system that can be operated across the board, or that needs somebody to action, and then it's not as effective as it needs to be, and it speaks to a lack of control. Also, too, when you're looking at control, there must be a measurable output. What are the things, what are the turnaround times, what are we expecting to have? That it is particularly important feature, and it is crucial to ensure that the act that the operation and the organization selects the appropriate measurable outputs. In many business, for example, a currency means such as return on capital employed, return on investment, and performance ratios may be less meaningful than actual cash flow. You might have some companies who say, oh, we're not concerned about profit and loss, but we're just looking at cash flow. Because as long as the cash keeps coming into the organization, we could do X, Y, or Z. And there must be a model that everybody in the organization is able to predict and actually able to follow, as opposed to information only being between the CEO and the CFO. And the organization must have resources in place to ensure that it is capable of taking action. If you have an organization where before all the pandemic environment, before all the compliance in AML and CFT requirements, what we now understand as compliance, and you had a staff of 5 or 6, that is not sufficient bodies to run an operation $1 million, $2 million plus, if you are now having to put controls in place, as well as keep up with all the government regulations that are coming down the pipeline. Because between each action, there should be checks and balances, and always be wary of a organization where one individual is end up looking like the judge and the jury for any decision that is being made, because it takes away the objectivity and replaces it with subjectivity. And if that person is too authoritative and the employees feel intimidated, then you can almost guarantee that the controls will not be in place, and the organization might go south depending on the involvement of that key individual. So there should be the question of ethics versus compliance. Compliance is usually rules-based, the letter of the law. You got to fill out this form and that form and the next form. You have to do your certification, self-certification. You have to bring your proof of address. You have to bring your ID. And some companies take ID to mean passport as opposed to driver's license. Others say a government-issued ID, which could be a national insurance card because it's issued by the government, or it could be a driver's license. But you could have a foreign person come on this island and within a few months be able to sit and pass their driver's license and have a Bahamian driver's license. And so for certain businesses, they insist that it's the biometric information on your passport, because it actually speaks to nationality. And nationality, like Timiko says, speak to culture and expectation and how we will handle those particular things. So there's usually what they call hard outcomes as opposed to soft outcomes. And on the bottom of 148 is where they would give you the differentiation between the two. Hard outcomes are generally measured in financial or non-financial terms. Soft outcomes are less tangible and difficult or impossible to measure. If you had to put that in other words, one is quantitative and the other one is qualitative. In businesses, when they talk about quantitative, they're looking at the number of sales, for example. You're looking at revenue, for example. You're looking at cash flow. You're looking at the profit and loss statement. You're looking at assets, okay? Anything that would impact the financial reports, that was normally a hard or generally measurable financial documentation. However, there is something on the financial document that is shown sometimes but it's difficult to assess. And there's something called goodwill. How do we know the actual financial impact of goodwill? And goodwill really speaks to reputational capital and what the organization has gained over the years by doing business in XYZ. And so that could be something that appears to be more of a soft outcome as opposed to a hard outcome. But examples of hard outcome, they tell you it's on the bottom there. And just to get a feel for what we're talking about, production per employee, defects per unit of time of labor. If you're talking about a production line of something, absenteeism, breaches of compliance rules, default rates on loans, for example, how many people have defaulted on your loans or whatever have you. The soft skills are on page 149, or the soft outcomes are staff motivation level, customer satisfaction, response to advertising. I've seen companies doing a lot of surveying now, and survey and customer feedback forms that are filled out, so they could say X amount of persons have responded negatively to XYZ. The impact of any negative occurrence on reputation of the organization. All of those are what we will call and consider the soft outcomes. So you really have to know the difference between the hard outcomes and the soft outcomes. We're going to talk about, let's look at why this all is important. And I lost somebody else again. Who did I lose? A T or she? No, a T is here. Okay, I'm good. Yeah. Somebody just dropped off again, Tamiko. I was just about to have you look at two case studies that is in this section. One is on page 150, and the other one is on page 152. And I'm going to prepare a breakout room. Case study 1 is for breakout room 1, which is the Barings Bank. And then case study 2, retail company, would be case study 2. So I'm going to prepare breakout rooms for you